The Omnipotent Self, a study in self-deception and self-cure by Paul Bousfield. Part 2, Practical Applications. Chapter 14, Conclusion. The previous portion of this book has been devoted to showing how narcissism may be harmful and how, in its endeavor to obtain satisfaction, it may render the individual unhappy in the utmost degree. It is possible that the reader will have gathered that the author regards narcissism as wholly and completely a useless and detrimental element in life. The more so since at various points we have had to emphasize that in one form or another, very little of it persisting in adult life may be a great deal too much. It should be realized, however, that narcissism to a slight extent and at certain periods plays an important and also necessary part in the individual's life. We mentioned at one place that a certain amount of identification was beneficial in choosing one's life partner, whereas too much identification might lead to one's choosing a sexual partner of the same sex. A small amount of identification might lead to one's choosing a partner with the same tastes, and would further lead to a tendency to enjoy whatsoever the other one enjoyed, and to dislike what the other one disliked, and this similarity would lead to a certain harmony in life. Narcissism is a normal thing in the newborn infant, and narcissism is the root of many virtues, but its final adult form must be sublimated and very much attenuated. It is like the salt in cooking. A little is essential to bring out the flavor, but a very little more spoils the whole dish. A certain amount of self-love, self-appreciation, self-importance, and self-consciousness of one's own capacities is necessary in everyone. Without it, he would be ill-prepared to cope with men and circumstances. But this necessary self-importance and self-appreciation is not, as many might think, due to narcissism alone. It has a slight narcissistic element, but it is largely a result of other unconscious instincts, which we have not attempted to deal with here, and we only mention it lest the reader should draw the conclusion that these necessary elements in our character are drawn purely from a narcissistic basis, and that he should therefore be left puzzled as to how, if he should eradicate narcissism, he would be able to retain necessary characteristics which apparently belong to this same instinct. It is also very necessary for the reader to bear in mind that much which may be developed from narcissism is useful, even though the original from which it came may be dangerous and harmful. Moreover, a certain amount of enjoyment of fantasy, such as is obtained from novels or theaters, may be in many people quite a useful and adequate form of relaxation. With them, it may be strictly cut off from real life, may be strictly limited as regards time and place, and, in fact, entirely under their control. In such persons, it forms a useful element in their lives. I do not say that if their early education and environment had been different, they might not possibly possess an even better form of recreation, but merely that, taking facts as they are, in certain cases, it forms a useful factor in the working scheme of life. In others, however, in those where it has exceeded the limits of absolute control, it is necessary, for the time being at least, to attempt to cut it out as completely as possible, because where it is allowed slight free play, it is liable to get out of hand, unless it can be dealt with absolutely at the will of the individual. Hence, the necessity for such stringent treatment as I have laid down in the previous chapters of this book. I have attempted to show that happiness is, for the most part, within the individual's own grasp. Happiness comes from within the individual and not from without. Unhappiness must not be confused with pain, neither mental nor physical, for pain is a normal reaction to a harmful stimulus which all are liable to feel. It is for the most part beyond the individual's control so long as the stimulus persists, but the peace of mind, the absence of worry, of irritability, of perpetual uneasiness, which we call unhappiness, lies within the control of everybody. It largely consists in continually recognizing what facts are unchangeable and ceasing to bemoan or fantasy about these unchangeable facts. It is true that the road to happiness may be difficult if we have long been accustomed to tread the path of narcissism, but it is equally true that if the advice laid down in this book be followed patiently and systematically, a very much happier frame of mind will be attained as a result. In a few cases, narcissism is not a predominant factor causing the temperamental disturbance, although superficially it may appear to be so. In such cases where other primitive instincts are really of paramount importance, the same degree of improvement will not be attained by this method of self-treatment, and only a more prolonged course of regular psychoanalysis is likely to produce the desired result. Happiness is not to be found by seeking happiness in the direct sense. This, I am aware, sounds very much like a mere high-sounding thought of a writer. It is the sort of phrase that people dismiss with the remark, "That is all very well in theory." This statement, however, is not made from any moral or sentimental point of view, nor on any purely theoretical grounds, but as a scientific fact which has been demonstrated as the result of psychological research. It may be interesting to note here how much the psychology of happiness is in agreement with many of the teachings of the New Testament, although a different terminology and mode of expression may be used. It was pointed out earlier how the individual who employed too much fantasy thought in youth might worry himself into an early grave, although he was the same individual who most desired a long life. It has now been shown that happiness does not come to those who seek happiness, but to those who can adapt themselves to realities. That is, to those who can control their narcissism. Narcissism is not so very different from the word self, as used in Christian teachings, and any who are interested enough to compare them will find that there is considerable parallelism between Christian teachings and certain psychological observations. I must emphasize the fact once more that patience, that is, a realization of the time factor, is very necessary for those who attempt self-treatment on the lines indicated in this book. For since lack of this is often one of their faults to start with, they may otherwise involve themselves in a vicious circle from which they do not escape. Patience and attention to detail will, however, enable them to accomplish that improvement which they have set out to achieve. In the words of Horace, happiness is here, happiness is everywhere, if only a well-regulated mind does not fail you. The end. End of chapter 14, end of the book, The Omnipotent Self, A Study in Self-Deception and Self-Cure by Paul Bousfield, narrated by Rex King.